Hi, welcome to a new Historical Lies video. This one is going to be on what's known as the third wave, an experiment that took place in Palo Alto, California in 1967, where high school teacher Ron Jones took one class, which turned into several classes, and had them adopt a fascist mentality in supposedly just 1 week. I first researched this about 10 years ago, and it just never had the right time or the place to present the massive material that I had gained from it. It's important for two reasons, and we want to share it. One is because what happened in this experiment in 1967, which many people first got aware of from a movie in 1981 known as The Wave, which was based on Ron Jones's book from 1976 that he wrote almost 10 years after the experiment. And that the experiment we saw is, in a sense, happening today. The third wave is not a 1967 experiment. It's happening right now in front of our eyes. So it's very important to go into the story as it was in 1967, partially to see the parallels to it. It's important to remember that this experiment took place in 1967 in Silicon Valley. Palo Alto is the home of the tech industry, and it was just beginning to build in the late 1960s. So Google, Facebook, Apple, everything has its base or its origin in Palo Alto. So it's very interesting that this experiment, as well as the famous prison experiment, which took place just up the road at Stanford University a few years later, these psychological experiments are happening in the home of Silicon Valley, the home of the technological revolution, also during the exact time the Vietnam War is going on. So we have a very interesting origin to this story that I don't think should be seen as a separate, certainly not a 1 week event. The second thing we want to dig into this story of the experiment is the actual story itself, because it's been claimed for a long, long time that this took place over 5 days, and I'm going to go through the 5 days with you in a bit of short form, to not go into massive detail on it. But that this happened over 5 days. However, I'm going to start posting pictures as we go along. You can see this newspaper report from the 21st of April 1967, which discusses in the Cubberley High School newspaper, discusses that this experiment had taken place, and that the big rally that turned out at the end, where they were supposed to have been shown that their great leader was Adolf Hitler, took place on a Wednesday. So that right away destroys the notion that this started on a Monday and ended on a Friday. So we know it has to be more than 5 days. So what was it? Was it 8 days? Was it 2 weeks? Was it 2 months? Students kept quiet about this for a long, long time. No one talked about it. No one discussed it. It never made it into any media at the time, other than the local high school newspaper and a few articles. And then all of a sudden, a particular version of this was presented by Jones, and that version has been accepted continually to this day. So all of these things, we're going to go into this experiment, not just to look at what happened in 1967, how it relates to right now. That's really important. How does this experiment relate to what we're dealing with right at this moment? Because it's very simple. This experiment was about a figure that the students trusted. They trusted Ron Jones. They liked him. He was their favorite teacher, 25 years old, young, charismatic, doing very unique things in the classroom to try to get his students to have critical thinking, to get them to think, which is, to me, a very credible thing to have as a teacher. Get your students to think, not to repeat. But the question is, the point was, someone in authority tells people to do it, and they just do it. Even to the point of creating their own secret police, their own secret organization, a complete underground, small, secret society was generated supposedly just in 1 week. And we have to go through and ask that. So this took place in a high school called Cubberley High School in Palo Alto, California, supposedly in the week of April 1967. It came about because one of his students, during a discussion on Nazi Germany in his contemporary world history class for grade 10, was having trouble understanding how the German people could have followed the Nazis and could have handled their actions so easily. So since Jones couldn't demonstrate in any possible way through just discussion of this topic, he decided over the weekend to create a one-day experiment. And that's how it started, was for him to answer this question that he felt he couldn't answer about Nazi Germany. Now, this discussion we're going to have here today that I'm presenting is only about the experiment of 1967, and we're going to be going through the specifics of psychological brainwashing and almost psychological warfare, and how that relates to today. So what happened in World War II, though those events are not going to be discussed or looked at, and if comments come up on that, I'm just going to ignore them, because we have to focus, I want to be focused on what's important, which is, to me, which is right now, what's happening now. But we're using history to understand where we might be and where we may have come from. So there was also, as I said, there was a movie that came out in 1981 that was sort of the start of this for most people, and I think it's actually become a movie that's shown in a lot of classrooms around the world. I would probably say somebody under the age of 40, 45, maybe 30 or 40% of the world's population might have seen this movie called The Wave. And other than that, things have been kept very quiet. There were a couple of websites that were up about 15 or 20 years ago that started digging into discrepancies and things I'm going to be bringing up here. Those websites are now long gone. Thankfully, I saved a lot of detail and made notes on them. But in response to that, it seems a documentary that came out by some of the key students that were involved in the third wave came out in 2010 called A Lesson Plan. And it's highly interesting. I recommend you go and check it out. You have to pay a few dollars to watch it on Vimeo. But it's mostly made by two students, Patrick Neal and Hancock. I can't remember his first name off the top of my head. But they were the ones who put together the video, and they go through a lot of the detail on the third wave. And of course, you have to start asking, well, why would we be having any kind of discussion? The people who made the video were the ones who made the documentary, are the ones who were in the experiment. They actually went through it themselves. So why is there any question? They're first-hand accounts. But as we all know, even first-hand accounts can be very, very varied. Very, very, very nice wording. They can be very different based on people's perceptions, people's ideas, and in this case, when we're dealing with obviously some form of mental control, some form of a mental experiment, something that I don't know if it lasted weeks, months, maybe even years. This thing might have been going on for another 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Who knows, underneath the surface, where the students were maybe being tracked and still being watched to how they were reacting at the end of this experience. So I think even though you've got a documentary made by the people who actually were there at the time, as opposed to me, right? I wasn't there, we still need to ask a lot of questions about what's being presented. So I've already showed you a bit of the discrepancies in the dates and the times. One thing to keep in mind that's very important as to where the students' minds would have been during this experiment is, in 1967, the Vietnam War is revving up to a very high level, and you're getting in the United States this very polarized view of the world, where you have the establishment, which wants to foster the Vietnam War and everything else that's going on, and then you have this counterculture that's beginning, mostly coming out of the JFK assassination, where they begin a massive distrust of the government and a massive distrust of those who they had felt, even at that time, had Kennedy killed. And so didn't want to trust the government. And then once they got them involved in the war, once they got them involved in some very deep things in the 60s, this counterculture clash, certainly in Northern California where this was taking place, was at a very high level. Added that these students are about 15, 16 years old. They're a couple of years away from potentially being drafted into Vietnam themselves. So the thought that they could be given not just a way to better themselves, but a way that, as it eventually they came to believe that they were part of a new political party that was being formed in the United States, that was going to completely overhaul the government of the US was one of the carrots that brought, I think, a lot of the students in. They had a fear of the draft. Of course, there was a fear in the classes. We'll see there was potential of how their grade was going to be based on this experiment. So there's a sense of fear to allow them to go in, which we have today, right? There's a sense of fear that's pulling people into the authoritarian story. There's a hope that by following the authoritarian story, something better will come out of it. And then the individual critical thinking just stops, and all you have is a group hive mentality, which soon became run in almost a Gestapo-like fashion, as we will get into. Lastly, to think about, in the time that it happened, other than the school newspapers, it was never put in any other media outlet. It was never in any other newspapers. In fact, it was never discussed, supposedly, until Ron Jones ran into one of his old students by accident on the street one day, who gave him the old third wave salute. And this gave him the memory of the experiment, which he seems to have kind of forgotten, he says, and decides to write a book about it. And so begins the story where he and now various students have been traveling the world, lecturing on how easy it is to have fascism take over the mind. So we're going to look at all this and go through it day by day and see what it can tell us. So the first day, as we mentioned, it was started because supposedly a student in the class on Friday asked Jones a question about Nazi Germany that he couldn't answer. So he arrived on, this is according to Jones in the Standard story, he arrived on Monday morning into his class, dimmed the lights, and played the German composer Wagner, which is, of course, Hitler's favorite composer. Nothing was said about Nazi Germany, only that he was going to give them the keys to power and success through discipline. So that was the carrot, power and success through discipline, which he wrote on the board, strength through discipline. And many of the students at the time claimed this was very odd because he was not known for being a disciplined teacher or very organized even, but they decided to go along with it because he had done all sorts of experiments and all sorts of fun things in the class. And all that it was claimed to have done, and which seems to be true, that day one seems to have been like this. His main components were to get the students sitting in a new seating posture, so feet on the floor, back and spine straight. He would then do speed drills to see how quickly they could go from outside to inside, back to their seats. And as they did this more and more, the students became a more and more organized group, a more and more functioned machine. They were then told they had to stand by their desk to ask or answer a question. They had to remark, beginning with Mr. Jones, acknowledging him, and then ask their question in the least number of words possible. Supposedly, we'll get that to the next day. So Jones claimed in his book that he seemed to him that none of the students had made the connection to what they were doing that day as a strength through discipline experiment was related to Friday's and in fact the week's teaching on Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And Jones claims this was a one-day experiment, something to show his students about, and they were going to go. He was going back to his normal teaching the next day. But when he arrived for the next day, there was something completely different. When asked about some of the attraction to it, I'll go into that in a minute. Let's go to day two then, since I've started day two. So supposedly this one-day exercise all of a sudden became more when, as Jones was quoted in a magazine, I definitely wanted the students to have some understanding of Nazi Germany. I thought it would be a stepping stone into what it would be like in a totalitarian state if they followed the directions of a teacher in a martial way. And when he came in, though, and forgotten about it, there were the students all sitting perfectly in class, at attention, and supposedly, at the spur of the moment, then just went to the blackboard, wrote the words, strength through community. And then he began to start teaching a communal atmosphere to the students. So supposedly this experiment continues, but you're going to see as I go through today, day two and day three, how much is being presented to these students, how much they say is being claimed, either one, that's way too much you'll see to be happening in 2 straight days. It's too much to just be planned on the spur of the moment. There's obviously a lot of planning and a lot of preparation that's gone into this. He did say at this point on day two that the experiment was going to continue, and students who participated in it would receive an A automatically. If you participated, you got an A. If you chose not to participate, you would leave the class and you would get a C. You were allowed to start a revolution. If the revolution succeeded, you would also get an A. But if the revolution failed, you would get an F. So simply by following the wave, according to this presentation, you were guaranteed an A. But if you tried to counter it, if you tried to counter it, you could also still get an A, but you could also get an F. So by going against the classroom now, your chances of failure now existed, when by going with it, you had no chance of failure. If you just left, you would be getting a C, which is of course an average grade, and you've done neither. It's claimed, of course, so many students were so concerned about their grades and their need to get into college, because if you get into college, you were less likely to be drafted, to be into the draft. So this was a way, in a sense, of getting the students to guarantee the A for the class by simply going along. That's one presentation of it. One of the students, Mark Hancock, that's his name, he talks a lot, he's sort of one of the spokespeople now. I was a mischievous 15-year-old, and I remembered right away I wanted to be one of those revolutionaries who got an A, but it went well beyond grades pretty quickly, and at the end I was scared to death. Again, this began then to focus on community. So within a day, by one day he had set up, by day 3 he had set up membership cards, so you now had to have a membership card to be in. He had set up a name for the movement, which he called the Third Wave, which again, I'm shocked that nobody would catch on that, hey, he's just been talking about the Third Reich, and now all of a sudden he's acting in an authoritarian manner and presenting this thing, the Third Wave. Like, high school students might be 15 years old, but a lot of them are pretty smart. They're going to catch on to that, and especially when he adds the salute that he comes up with, which is I guess it was tapping your chest and holding your arm in a particular way. If you watch lesson plan, they show it, and I think I have the actual logo, which I can put up on the screen here, the Third Wave logo. So that's the first thing, is how no one would get this, and all you'd have to have is one student get it, and kind of say to a couple of them after class, like, hey, you don't see the connection? Like, he's showing Nazi Germany to us. Like, come on, it would have to be pretty obvious to at least 1 or 2 students, but supposedly none of the students get it, which is also strange in its own way. The community began to expand. Student guards were placed at the door so that nobody could get in or out unless they had one of these membership cards. There were older students, what's called from the executors car club, who were part of Jones's 12th grade government class, that became his personal bodyguards. And again, you've got then he started adding other rules. Rules being like, it was illegal for party members to congregate in groups larger than 3 outside of class. So once class was over, none of the members of the Third Wave were allowed to be in a group of more than 2 people. And this was had to be followed 24 hours a day, including at home. And there soon became, again, apparently, there certain students, which I'll show you, became members of a secret police. And public trials in the classrooms were held to banish resistors to the library, who, of course, got the reduced grade and were out of the class. So again, you're asking, this is quite bizarre, because how does all this manage to take place in 3 days? How could you even if you had it planned, to get all of these things set up so that by 3 days you've got the membership cards, you've got the badges, you've got the presentation, you've got the secret police set up, you've got the trials, there's no way. This is like, at best, maybe a few weeks you could get all this together and running smoothly. The next part of it was, already by day 3, supposedly, students were not going to their other classes anymore, and students were coming into Jones's history classes, which this now Third Wave had expanded beyond the one class he had started with, and it was now like, I guess all of his classes, or all of his history classes, were now Third Wave classes, and students were leaving their own regular schedule classes to join. So they had to become a member, right? Because I said they had people at the doors. You couldn't get in unless you were a member. And so apparently they were coming from other schools. Again, I don't see, I know high school students have a pretty good network. It's certainly not like it is today with cell phones and the internet, but still, even in the 1960s, word could travel quickly, but not that quickly. I don't doubt that some of these things were correct. I doubt the timing. Lastly was, and this is really important, was these secret police, and I'm going to read just a little bit of what's in here. This is from Mark Hancock. He then had students put their heads down and secretly tapped 3 of them on the shoulder. Whoever received a tap was given a special assignment to report any students not complying to the wave's rules. Anyone accused of not following the rules must face a public trial in the morning, where he would come in and stand in front of the class with us sitting up straight, Hancock recalled. Then he would pull out a paper out of his shirt pocket and he would say a name. That person would stand up and he would say, "My secret police have informed me you've broken a rule. What do you have to say for yourself? If we're going to be a disciplined group and do great things, we can't have a rule breaker here." He would then ask the students one by one, "Is this person guilty?" until he had everyone chanting, "Guilty, guilty, guilty." Hancock added, "It scared the hell out of me." Once convicted, the student was exiled from the wave and not allowed to come back to class. For Jones, he said the experiment reached the turning point on day 3, when a student bodyguard accompanied him into the teacher's faculty lounge. There was an English teacher sitting there who said, "Hey, students aren't allowed in here." And this child said, "I'm not a student, I'm a bodyguard." I knew at that moment that this young adult had crossed some invisible line, and this was no longer a game or a classroom activity. It was something real to this person, and I was crossing the same line, Jones said. I was beginning to like the order and adulation. It was pretty intoxicating. 3 days, right? 3 days you've managed to, and to create this kind of euphoria. Now, okay, think about it in our world. Think about where we were in January to where we are now. Things only took 2 or 3 months to get unbelievably revved up and for the whole world to start shutting down and acting and thinking in particular ways. So things can happen quickly, but again, I think what we're seeing here is a very different experiment. And while we're not going to be able to know what exactly the experiment was, I think just to get that in our head that something different is going on than what we've been originally suggested on this. Now there were resistors, 2 specifically, Alicia Hess and Sherry Tui. Sherry talks in the lesson plan documentary. Very interesting woman. I have a tremendous amount of respect for her. She was one of the few members of this group right from the beginning who questioned what was going on, who questioned the authority, who questioned the rules, and was banished, she says, on like day 2 to the library, where she attempted to get information from the librarian, the vice principal, but she claimed nobody would help her. She had little credibility. She was just a student. And so she decided on her own to form a resistance group, which she called the Breakers. And in that documentary, she said her father drove her to Cubberley, often before school had started, to hang posters, anti-wave posters in the hall. Now, they would already had posters, massive numbers of posters. Again, when are these posters getting made? So if supposedly it's in 1 week, all these posters are on the wall. Tui was coming in early in the morning and putting her posters as far up on the wall as possible so that it would be difficult for the students to reach up and pull them down. They would have to go get a ladder and climb up and actually take her posters down. So they stayed up for quite a long period of time. And supposedly nobody knew it was her, that she had been able to do this completely anonymously during the entire experience. It's also interesting in that documentary that while everyone else in the documentary is talking about this 5-day period, how it started on a Monday, it ended with this rally on a Friday. But if you listen to Tui in the video, she doesn't talk about the experiment happening. She talks about it over weeks. This happened during the many weeks that it went on, and how she handled her resistance. So here's one person who is outside of the group, you might say. She's not gone through the depth of the experience of whatever these people who were in it went through. And So I think she would be a more credible witness as to the possibility of how long this went. And she's saying weeks. So we're talking at least 2-3 weeks for sure. There are even a couple of students who over the course of the last few years have even thought it lasted the entire semester in their mind. That they feel it, so it might have happened for 2 or 3 months. So again, we're really having to wonder what we're dealing with. But the story, if we go back to the story is on day 4. Jones had now gotten scared by how far the thing had slipped out of control, and he decided to end it on this 4th day. So he told the class on the Friday that the third wave was not actually just an experiment, it was real, and that there was now going to be a third political party being started, that there were third wave classes happening at schools all across the United States, and that on the Friday, there were going to be, their national leader was going to be shown on television at a 12 o'clock rally. This is where the other female student who was a resistor tried to beg the class at this point not to go to the rally. But she, of course, was banished to the library with Tui at this point and given her C, I guess. But this was the point. It was that this rally was going to happen and that their great leader was supposed to be presented. The rally. And again, we know there actually was some kind of rally. If you look in again, there's the April 21st edition of the Cubberley school newspaper. You can see it talks about it, and it talks about the people in the rally. It talks about the static on the television sets, but that's all it says. It doesn't mention anything beyond, but here's the story. This is the story of what has happened. So the story claims that at noon on Friday, 200 students came into the auditorium for the special assembly. Jones led the students in chanting the group slogans, which apparently got louder and louder, of course. Then at 12:05, he turned on the television monitor, but instead of a televised address from the leader, the students were just presented with white static. After a few minutes of waiting, the students became restless, and this is a key part of the story. One student yelled, "There is no leader, is there?" That's a kind of a strange thing to yell after 2 minutes, if you have to really think about it. The odds of that happening are very low, but okay. At that point, it's claimed that Jones then put on a rally of the Nazis from Nuremberg, one of the famous Nuremberg rallies, and claimed that their leader was actually Adolf Hitler, and that they had all been in an experiment in fascism, and that they had willingly created a sense of superiority of themselves over the rest of everyone else and the rest of their peers. Supposedly, Jones says, "Listen closely, I have something important to tell you. Sit down, there is no leader. There is no such thing as a national youth movement called the Third Wave. You have been manipulated. You've been shoved by your desires into the place you now found yourself. You are no better or worse than the German Nazis we have been studying." He claimed there was now a wide range of emotions. Mark Hancock remembers that many of the students cried. Others claimed they knew it was a joke all along. Others, like him, claimed they ran out in fear before Jones made his final announcement. At the end, this is the next thing to really have to wonder about. All that was claimed was silent. And there seems to have been a suggestion that, in fact, an unspoken agreement or even a spoken agreement was made that this should never be spoken of again with each other. Which again, it seems like an unbelievably strange thing to create. Jones claims that silence is what happens when you feel shame. Others, of course, came out of it feeling the experience was unbelievably fantastic, that they had been taught an incredible lesson, that they had learned something about thinking and about believing in authority and about critical thought. But this is what really is strange to me, is that, first of all, we're dealing with this incredible, seemingly enforced silence. And this goes right into the next day. So supposedly in the story, the next Monday in the story, right? We know that's not true because the rally was on a Wednesday, but supposedly in the story on the Monday, all this was just forgotten, never talked about, and they just moved on into talking about Vietnam. Now, that in itself sounds utterly bizarre, particularly from a teacher who's wanting to use this experience as a way of teaching his students an invaluable life lesson. Wouldn't you take at least one class to go into detail, to discuss to your students what happened, why you did it, to hear what did you think about it, what did you feel, how did you go through it, what were the emotions you felt, how can we learn from this for the rest of our lives? But the story goes, it was just like literally brushed under the table. It was never to be spoken of again, and they just moved on with the rest of the year. Which, if that's true, and it seems like no student has come up to, at this point, say they had a large open class discussion about it, then that leads more to me of some kind of brainwashing experiment. Because if you look at the way cult members are, or the way anybody who has been involved in a serious brainwashing organization, they can literally just have, from a certain moment, their memory just almost gone of the experience. It can literally be just wiped away. So I also partially wonder what was going on at the rally, in truth, because the people who wrote about the rally didn't mention anything about Hitler, didn't mention anything about Nuremberg rally. All they mentioned was there was white static on the television set. And as you know, white static is a type of hypnotic overlay, a way of creating a hypnotic state, hypnotic trance in a person. I think Darren Brown did something like that in one of his specials, where he used sort of just the white static on the screen to create a particular hypnotic state in the audience. So I wonder, is a hypnotic state being created in the audience? If so, is there subliminal messaging in it? Is there something subliminal that was being put on loudspeakers? Is there something that was said? Because again, to me, that's one of the first things that I really question about this story, is that all of a sudden, once it's over, there's no talking about it. A couple of other things that I think are very unique that should be mentioned, and again, it's just Mark Hancock. He's the guy that's the #1 interviewee in all of the newspaper articles and things that have been written about it. So this is what he said about the beginning of the experiment. No one had any reason to be alarmed that April when he asked the students, when the student asked how Nazis could have been so appealing to the general population and that no one spoke up during the Holocaust. Jones responded, "I don't know. Let's try an experiment. I will be the dictator and you will be the movement." Now, that's come up nowhere. I've seen that absolutely nowhere. That's not in Jones's stuff. That's not in any other student's recollection that Jones had actually said he's going to be a dictator and that you're going to be the movement, because you wouldn't announce you'll be a dictator, because nobody will follow you. You don't follow a dictator. You follow someone you believe is going to help you, is going to give you what you don't have. So right away, the main person who's presenting the information is presenting very uncredible information about the beginning of the experiment. Another thing he says, what people don't understand is the way Jones rolled out the wave. We got sucked into it because it was so gradual. Gradual? In 4 days? There's no way something that's this intense is gradual. If it's over 4 days, this would have been an absolute overload assault on the mind, on the senses, on everything. It continues. By the time you felt trapped, there wasn't much you could do. The reality is that this was your social studies class and you really couldn't go anyplace else. The only thing you could have done is take the game to a new level and be a revolutionary, or try to get out through the administration. But it didn't seem like a possible avenue because everyone was part of the wave as far as you knew. Again, this is something I just don't necessarily agree with in principle, but if something else is going on, some completely different kind of experiment is happening, not the way it's described, then I think potentially we do have we do have something interesting happening. And again, take out of this, because I'm almost through my presentation here, this is, if this experiment is at a much bigger level, that if this is being monitored, whether it's by members of the US military, by the Pentagon, by the CIA, by, again, these silicon giant technology firms, if they're watching and using this experiment to see how they are best able to manipulate and control human minds, how they are best able to create certain compliant behavior quickly, that the experiment could have been designed to see, can we get people to do what we want them to in the easiest, simplest fashion? And that in itself is pretty dangerous. That has nothing to do with Hitler and Nazi Germany necessarily. That has to do with the manipulation of the mind, which has been going on for 50 to 100 years. The human being humans are a hypnotized species. We are constantly being hypnotized, not only by the environment, but particularly the things that are in our control mechanism, or that our control mechanisms are constantly presenting the world and reality to us in such a way so that we don't question anything, we don't think about anything. You are kept in a sort of semi-zombie state to believe what you're told and not question authority. And once television came in, it got worse. Once the internet and computers came in, it got worse. Now once smartphones and everything else has come in, it's gotten worse. The average human being, not so much the people watching this, if you're watching this and you've watched 36 minutes of this, on some level you have unzombified yourself, let's be clear. But you're talking about, what, 6 to 6.5 billion are not in a really critical thinking state, and that doesn't happen by accident. I think humans have a natural critical thinking and questioning and a real wanting to know the world around them and themselves. So to not be doing that, for humans not to be following what I think is natural human behavior of deep questioning, indicates some type of hypnotic trance that people are in. That's the best way to describe it. You know, we talk in spiritual terms about awake and asleep. I don't think that's the right terminology. I think hypnotized and unhypnotized are a much better way. Non-thinking, critical thinking. And again, as you go through this experiment and look at it in more detail, think about what I've shared with you, maybe watch the documentary and begin to start not just saying what was really happening in that time period in 1967, because again, that's part of what's important here. What really happened in 1967 and what was learned from it. What was learned from it? Did the students actually learn anything from it, or were the students so brainwashed that it's literally, it's out of most of their heads? But who was running the experiment? Was it just Jones? Was it more than that? And what did they learn? And what might they have taken with new and better and understanding the experience to become parts of the next 50 years, 60 years of which we are now seeing in our world today. So I want you just to keep that in mind as you watch more detail and think and read more detail on this. I really think it's an important thing for you to study, and that's why I've made such a long video on this. I do want to leave you with a couple of last comments. This is from a student named Rick Schloss, and this was also in the documentary. I don't recall something like this in the movie, but it was definitely in the documentary, where he was somebody from, I think he was from another school, and he'd happened to come to Cubberley for some reason, and there had been a table set up, you know, like a lunchtime table where you try to join the Star Wars club or you join the whatever club, right? And the third wave had a table, and they were trying to recruit people into the third wave who weren't in their classes. And this Rick Schloss recalled stopping, asking questions about it, but he wasn't really getting much in a way of detailed response when he was asking why should he join it, what was it, what could they be getting out of it. And in fact, the more he questioned them, the more aggressive they got, to the point of them attempted to block my path and wanting to know my name. One of the guys actually pulled out a small notepad. We almost came to blows at that moment, and I don't recall what stopped the escalation, but I knew I was willing to go the distance with these two. I let the entire subject of the wave pass until I saw the TV movie about it. I called my mom, who had also watched it, and we asked what she remembered. So again, they are not only getting, that the students are getting literally violent, and violent over just being asked about what your movement was. So you have to start asking, again, how much did the students know or not know, believe or not believe of what they were a part of? Again, you could say, well, in 3 days, they wouldn't really know much of what they were part of, but I don't think in 3 days you could get anyone to be that necessarily aggressive and intense, but maybe in a course of a couple of weeks you could, if you had really done your homework and really prepared yourself properly. Again, we've got the issues of the questions about the rally, but I think we've gone through enough of all that, enough of what might have been there and that. So I'm just going through the rest of my notes here, seeing if there's anything we want to discuss before we finish. So let's take it to today. What from the third wave can we potentially see applying right now? Well, the first would be, the main part of the third wave was following orders. It was doing what authority says because they are authority. And of course, you might be punished for not following it, or at the very least not receive a powerful reward by doing what they tell you. The second was quite clearly no independent thought. There was a groupthink that had developed, and only 1 or 2 people had questioned this, which they were quickly banished to the library. They felt threatened, and it also meant they were no longer a part of the group on a daily basis, and they were shunned by the group during the rest of the day. So even though they had been friends, she had been friends and had known these people, her ability to communicate with all of her friends, all the people in the group were shut out. So there was no critical debate that was able to happen between the members in the group and anybody outside of it. All they had was themselves, and if you had questions about it, or you would of course be afraid of, perhaps by talking about it, you've broken a rule, and you were going to be put in front of one of these trials and kicked out of the class. So you could also see that dissenting opinions or questioning about it would have stopped very early. The third thing you saw in this experiment was rituals and special symbols and clothes to set one apart from others. And I'm sure you can see that right now, where you're starting to see what's going on is a form of ritual with special symbols and special clothes to distinguish members from those who are critically thinking and are, in a sense, kicked out to the library. Again, a sense of fear and reward, that's very important. The students, if it was just a simple fun experiment, nobody would have potentially gotten anywhere deep with it at all. There had to be a sense of fear and reward. Again, the reminder of there was no meetings and discussions. They could only be in groups of 2. And the larger you get groups together, the more people you have in one space, the more possibility for different opinions and different suggestions and different conversation happens. So again, think about what's happening today as you're allowed to have less and less and less people in one place, in connection with each other. That's very similar to the third wave, because again, if you don't have varied people with you, you will only hear the same opinion again and again and again and again. There'll be no topic for discussion. Again, there was no other information available. There was no other thought process available. And very, very important, Jones was trusted by the students. This is maybe the last and most important part of this. That the only reason I think this worked, I don't think any of the, even though there was a lot of teachers at my high school that I liked and many that I really respected, I don't think any of them would have been liked enough and trusted enough that they could have even got past day 1 with the students going about this. The students would have at some point just said, this is stupid, and we were just, I know I would have, this is just retarded, I would have said, and they'd just be kicked out, and that would have been the end of it. At least for me, I don't doubt I would have been gone on day 1, because I would have wanted to know, why are we doing this? Which is the exact question Sherry Tui asked. The reason she got kicked out was on day 2, something was happening, just why are we doing this? Out. So, but Jones, I guess, could do this because of how much they liked him, but how much they trusted him. And again, once an authority figure has established trust in another person or another group, they can get them to do tremendous things, on one sense, on a positive level, they can also manipulate that person or that group very, very easily, because the trusted figure, why would the trusted figure be lying to me? Why would the trusted figure be wanting something to be harmful for me? You would just follow along. You would just do what the trusted figure said. So the more trust the figure had created, the more deep you could get the experience, the more deep the level of hypnosis, you might say, the more deep the level of groupthink can happen. So I've gone on for 45 minutes. I'll be somewhat amazed of anybody who's made it through the whole 45 minutes, but almost like congratulations, gold star if you have. I hope maybe you see a bit what I see in this. There's a lot of things to question. I certainly don't have the answers. I wasn't there. I've never interviewed the people who are there. I would love to. I would love to critically interview some of the people who were there and really ask them some of the discrepancies in the story, and ask, well, how can that possibly be? You know, something this important to you. I mean, this would have been, if you had actually been in this, even if you felt total guilt and shame for your behavior, total, like you had been totally treated terribly by this, and you know, again, supposedly never talked about again, you would remember it. Like this is something with certain discrepancies, and you would, of course, not remember it the same as your friend in the seat over and the girl up there. That you would all have your own, but there would be a foundation that would be quite similar. And in this case, it seems like the foundation stories are unbelievably varied. And I know someone will say, yeah, you know, you do that story where you tell one story to one person, they tell it to the next person, and by the time it gets to the 20th person, right, it's a completely different story. I understand that. But something that's just not a story someone told you as sort of a game and a little tiny experiment. This is huge. This would have been a major life event. I guarantee anybody who went through this would have to be like top 5 event of your life. And a top 5 event of your life, there's going to be a lot of things you're going to remember. And even if 1 or 2 or 3, yeah, just blacked some stuff out, just didn't want to think about it, there still should have been 197 at least, maybe more, who were involved in it and should remember it to some detail. And what's interesting is they seem not to. And again, I wonder what we're going through right now and what we are going to go through, because this is just warming up. So what's going to be coming in the next few months, potentially next year to 2 years, what's the memory going to be like 2 to 3 years from now? So the people in like 2024 who are there, I don't really think I will be, to be quite honest with you. But the people who are still there at that time, who've made it through whatever's going to happen and whatever is going to become of all this, what are they going to remember? What is their memory going to be of this 2020? Are they going to have a clear memory? Are they going to have a guilty memory? Are they going to have a happy, ecstatic memory? Are they going to have confused memory? Are they going to have no memory at all? A lot of us in the alternate history community, we've been studying history, particularly in the 1700s and the 1800s, because it seems like the history that's been presented ever since that time about that period is unbelievably wrong. It's so wrong that it's not even close to what looks like reality. That the information that's presented, the story that's presented, just doesn't come anywhere close to matching whatever little bits of factual evidence and whatever little bits of detail exist from that period. So again, we have to start already wondering now, when you look 4 years ahead, when you look 10 years ahead, when you look 50 years ahead, what is the memory going to be of these experiences now? What are the history books, pretending there are even history books 50 years from now, what are they going to say about the years of 2020? And I think that's also another interesting thing, to just sit, and as you're watching what's going on, as you're hopefully critically thinking about what's going on and making your own decisions and choices about what to do and what not to do, I'm not going to tell you what's best for you. You have to make your own choices, and you have to live with the various consequences of those choices. But it's to also wonder, how is this going to look next year, 10 years from now? Hi, yes. I am intermingling a video into this. It's about 5 or 6 hours later after I did the initial video that you started watching. I'm adding this in because as I was in the course of doing some of the editing and adding in the photographs, I was looking for photographs on the internet to put in the ones what you're seeing. I happened to see a Reddit thread that linked me to the website, the old website of the woman we've just been talking about, Sherry Tui. She died in 2013, but after she had done the lesson plan documentary for this, she had a website where she presented her view of the wave, and it's very, very interesting. It provides a lot of really good detail. I'll put the link below to you so you can go and read it yourself. She presents what she claims is 9 days of the experiment. So that's very important. She claimed it's 9 days, although she had it end on a Thursday, again, when the newspaper had it ending on the Wednesday. But she was very clear that it took this long because it gave her time on the first weekend to make all the posters that she made to put up in the school. So that's very important that we're showing, and that could make sense. 9 days of the actual experiment might be okay. What is really interesting is two pieces that she presents. One is on the first day. She said that the experiment began with Jones entering the class saying, "You 30 students are going to start a movement that will sweep the entire nation. You will be its future leaders." So to me, that makes more sense as to how the students would be engaged so quickly and how they would be instantly moving into the strength through discipline exercises of sitting in their chairs if they thought a national movement was starting and they were going to be the ones who were going to be its leaders. So that makes more sense. And it's also interesting why that hasn't appeared in any other story that I've come across. But that makes way more sense. The other is on the 9th day. She does talk about all the days in between and the challenges she faces of starting this resistance movement. But on the 9th day, she talks about that the rally happened at noon, and then this particular history class took place in the afternoon. So the class actually happened after the rally. It didn't happen on a Friday. Everybody went home and then they just came back on Monday and school started. The class was in session again a few hours after this rally. And she claimed, of course, she wasn't at the rally. She was just brought back from the library when the class restarted. And she said many of the students were just sitting and crying. They were sitting all by themselves. They were basically, I guess, in a sense of shock. And her description of it is that rather than Jones having any kind of discussion or overview of what had just happened, he just basically denounced and humiliated them and lectured them about their failure to do anything, to stand up. That he basically, she said, I'm just paraphrasing her now, that he compared them to Nazis and reprimanded them for how special and how much better they believed than everyone else and how they behaved. She then asked him what he thought about her then resistance and her involvement, and she claimed he got very angry with her and just said, "You didn't do anything." What's most important, though, I think, which is really interesting, is that according to her, he stopped teaching the class after that. He stopped teaching the class after that final class. She claims a student teacher from the local university came to teach contemporary world shortly after the third wave's ending. We saw Mr. Jones for a session. And he didn't return for a while until they began their Vietnam classes. So this is also very interesting to see that Jones didn't seem to continue teaching the class for a period of time. She doesn't say how long he was away for, whether it was a week, 2 weeks, a month, or whatnot. But that adds another piece to the story that, again, is never told. So go check the website. It's very interesting. It adds some... I'm presenting it here now because I'm tending to believe her view of the story. I think she's very credible. I think she's very honest in how I've seen her present herself, and certainly how she's presenting things here. So what I'm going to be saying after you go back to the regular video now, take some of it with a grain of salt. I do now think maybe the experiment did last only 9 or 10 days, that it was a 2-week experiment openly. But again, we have to question how long it lasted before or after.